"You were never part of this shop," my brother said, loud enough for the buyer, the shop foreman, and two hospice nurses to hear through the open office door. Nobody moved. Even the old welding fans over the work floor seemed to slow down, like the whole building had taken a breath and was waiting to see whether I would finally break. My brother, Richard, stood behind Dad's desk with a stack of sale papers under his hand, acting like that made him the owner of every burn mark, every late night, every winter morning that had ever lived inside those walls. The buyer sat across from him with a silver pen ready. The company's stamp was already on the packet. My locker key was still in my palm because Richard had just told me to clean it out by Friday. I looked down at the signature page, then at the closing schedule, then at one small reference line he had not bothered to read. Lease history, 2009. And suddenly I was not looking at my brother anymore. I was looking at my father's old voice, coming back through a folder Richard had always thought was just shop junk. Because back in 2009, Dad made me sign one clause that Richard forgot existed. He thought he was selling the shop before Hospice took our father. He did not know that clause could stop the money before it ever cleared. My name is Harold Mason. I am 66 years old, and I have worked inside Mason Welding for 41 years. I do not mean I stopped by. I do not mean I helped out during summers and then told stories later like the place raised me. I mean I opened that side door when the locks were frozen, swept metal dust before sunrise, burned the skin across my knuckles so many times the scars stopped looking separate, and learned to hear a bad weld before most men could see one. I wore red flannel because Dad said I looked like a walking warning sign. And after a while, the men in town knew that if the red flannel was already in the bay, Mason Welding was open, no matter what the weather said. The shop was not pretty. It was a long brick building with a patched roof, 3 bay doors, a narrow office that smelled like coffee and old invoices, and a floor that had been swept 10,000 times but still held 40 years of grit in the cracks. But to me, it was not a building. It was the place where my father taught me that steel did not care about speeches. Steel only cared whether your hands were steady. Dad's name was Frank Mason, and when I was young, he could pick up a length of pipe like it was a broom handle. He had forearms like bundled rope and a way of going quiet when the work mattered. He did not flatter people. If he said, "That'll hold," you carried those 3 words around for a month. I spent most of my life trying to earn them. Richard did not understand that. My brother was 3 years younger than me, and he had clean hands, even when he stood in the shop. I do not say that because I hated him back then. I did not. When we were boys, I thought Richard was the smart one, and I was the useful one. And for a long time, that arrangement felt fair. He could talk to bankers. He could read contracts without moving his lips. He wore pressed shirts and told people he handled the business side. I handled the side that sparked, smoked, cut, bent, broke, and had to be fixed before morning. Dad used to say every shop had 2 kinds of trouble, the kind you could solve with paperwork and the kind that burned through your gloves. Richard chose the first kind. I chose the second. The problem was, over the years, Richard started acting like only one of those kinds counted. He would come in near lunch, tap a finger on Dad's desk, complain about margins, then walk through the bay like the machines were noisy tenants he wished would move out. He did not know which compressor coughed before it failed. He did not know which old client paid late but always paid. He did not know which worker's wife had cancer, which apprentice needed gas money, or which emergency repair we took at midnight because a farmer's whole week depended on one broken hitch. But he knew where the deeds were. He knew the bank account passwords. He knew how to say, "technically," before making a man feel small. For years, Dad kept the peace between us. He never said Richard was useless, and he never said I was owed more than I had. Dad did not talk like that. But sometimes, when Richard left the office after one of his big speeches about efficiency, Dad would stand in the bay beside me and watch the sparks fall for a while. Then he would say something like, "A shop knows who feeds it." That was as close as Dad came to taking sides. I held on to those lines because men like my father did not waste words. Then the sickness came. At first, Dad called it being tired. Then he called it getting old. Then he stopped calling it anything at all, because the doctors had names for it, and none of those names made the room easier to breathe in. By the time hospice became part of our daily vocabulary, Richard had changed his tone. He did not yell. That would have been easier to fight. He became practical. That was the word he used for everything. Practical meant we should stop pretending Dad would come back to the shop. Practical meant we should look at the value of the property. Practical meant the workers could find other jobs if they had enough notice. Practical meant I was emotional when I said Dad would never want the sign taken down while he was still alive. "You're thinking with grief," Richard told me one Tuesday morning, standing in the office with his phone already buzzing in his hand. "I'm thinking with responsibility." I looked past him through the interior window, out at the bay where Lease, our foreman, was guiding a younger man through a repair on a trailer frame. Lease had been with us 22 years. He had 2 bad knees, 1 daughter in college, and the kind of loyalty you could not buy after the fact. "Responsibility to who?" I asked. Richard sighed, like I had disappointed him by being slow. "To the family, to Dad's estate, to reality." Reality. That was another word men like Richard used when they had already decided who would pay the price. I asked him if Dad had signed anything. Richard said Dad was in no condition to handle business, and that as the person already managing the financial side, he had authority to explore options. Explore options. 2 weeks later, a buyer walked through the shop wearing polished boots that had never met slag. He was polite enough, I suppose. He looked at the square footage, the yard access, the office, the bay height, the road frontage. He did not look at the wall where Dad had hung his first welding mask. He did not ask why the old break-room table had one leg welded from scrap. He did not notice that every man on the floor went quiet when he stepped in. Richard introduced him as Mr. Callahan and said he was interested in preserving the value of the property. I knew then that the shop had already become land in my brother's mouth. Not work, not history, land. That evening I drove to the hospice house after closing. Dad was thinner than he had any right to be. His hands, the same hands that once lifted steel and steadied mine over a bead, rested on the blanket like tools set down at the end of a long day. The television was on with no sound. I sat beside him and told him the East Bay door was sticking again because I did not know how to tell him his younger son was walking buyers through his life's work. Dad's eyes opened when I said, "Shop." They were cloudy, but not empty. I leaned closer. "Richard's talking about selling," I said. "Says it's practical." Dad's mouth moved a little. I thought he was trying to curse, and for a second that almost made me smile. Then his fingers shifted against the blanket, slow and weak, like he was searching for something that should have been there. "Folder," he whispered. I bent closer. "What folder?" His breathing scratched in his throat. "Your copy." I thought the medicine had pulled him backward in time. Dad had folders for everything: tax folders, vendor folders, insurance folders, equipment folders. Half the office cabinets were full of paper nobody but him understood. "Rest, Dad," I said. "We'll talk when you feel better." His fingers caught mine with surprising pressure. Not much, but enough to stop me from standing. 2009, he whispered. Then his eyes shut again, and the room went back to the soft clicking and humming that hospice rooms use to remind you time is still moving even when you are begging it not to. I drove home that night with 2009 sitting in my head like a bolt I could not loosen. I knew what he meant, or at least I knew part of it. In 2009, the shop almost died. People forget that kind of thing when a business survives. They remember the anniversary signs and the old newspaper article and the proud photos on the wall. They do not remember the winter when orders dried up, when 2 clients went bankrupt, when Dad stopped paying himself, when I took side jobs on Sundays and put the money back through the shop as cash repairs, so Richard would not call it charity. That year, Dad called me into the office after everyone had gone home. Snow was packed against the bay doors. The heater was losing its fight. Dad had a folder on the desk and 2 cups of coffee that had already gone bitter. "Sign here," he said. I laughed because that was how Dad presented everything, like he was asking me to pass a wrench. "What is it?" He slid the paper toward me. "Lease clause, operational protection." Lawyer wrote it up. I stared at him. "Dad, I work here. I don't lease from you." "You keep the doors open," he said. "That means something." I remember being embarrassed, almost annoyed. We were not a family that dressed love up in documents. If Dad trusted you, he handed you keys. If he respected you, he let you finish a weld without leaning over your shoulder. Paper felt like Richard's world, not ours. "Is this because of the bank?" I asked. "It's because men get clever when buildings become worth more than work," Dad said. That sentence stayed with me, but I still did not understand the weight of it. He tapped the page. "This says, if anything happens, nobody moves you out or transfers shop control clean without notice, review, and your say-so. You got operating rights tied to this place, not because I'm giving you a gift, because you earned protection from people who will call your labor sentimental when money shows up." I looked at him then, really looked at him. Dad was not sick in 2009, not like later, but he was tired in a way I had not wanted to admit. The shop had worn grooves into him. "Richard know about this?" I asked. Dad's face did not change. "Richard knows enough." "That's not an answer." "It's the one I'm giving." I signed because he asked me to. He signed because he had already decided. Then he made a copy, put the original in his folder, and handed mine to me in a brown envelope. "Keep your copy where nobody can sweet-talk you out of it," he said. I told him nobody was going to sweet-talk me out of anything. He looked at me over the top of his glasses. "You'd be surprised what family can make a man surrender just to keep peace." For 17 years, that envelope sat in a metal file box in my hall closet under old insurance papers, house records, and my late wife's recipe cards. I did not think of it as a weapon. I barely thought of it at all. Life kept going. The shop survived. Dad got older. Richard got smoother. I kept opening the doors. Then hospice came, and suddenly my father was whispering, 2009, like it was the only tool he could still hand me. The next morning I came to work before sunrise. The shop was dark except for the security light over the side door. I stood outside for a moment with my key in my hand and looked at the sign, Mason Welding. The paint was faded around the edges. Dad had wanted to replace it 3 times and never did, because he said a sign with weather on it told customers you had lasted. Inside, I turned on the bay lights 1 row at a time. The machines emerged out of the dark like old animals waking up. I made coffee. I checked the schedule. I wrote 2 job notes for Luis. For about 20 minutes, I could almost pretend the day was normal. Then I saw the packet on Dad's desk. Not hidden, not even tucked away. A sale packet with colored tabs, a survey map, and a printed timeline. Richard had left it there because men like him mistake confidence for invisibility. I did not open every page. I did not need to. The first page had Mr. Callahan's company name. The second had a proposed closing date. The third had language about transfer of possession. My throat went dry. They were not exploring options. They were closing. Luis appeared in the doorway behind me. He did not step into the office. He looked older that morning than he had the week before. "Harold," he said quietly. I closed the packet. "You know about this?" He rubbed one hand over his mouth. "Richard told me not to get in the middle." "That's not what I asked." Luis looked toward the bay, where the younger men would start arriving soon. "Buyer came twice, took measurements, asked about clearing equipment." Clearing equipment. The phrase hit me harder than I expected. Not upgrading, not preserving. Clearing. "When?" I asked. "First time last Thursday. Second time yesterday after you left for hospice." I nodded because if I spoke too quickly, I was afraid of what would come out. Luis lowered his voice. "He said some of us might be offered temporary work during transition." Temporary. Another clean word for a dirty thing. Before I could answer, Richard walked in wearing a navy overcoat and carrying 2 coffees from the expensive place downtown. He looked from me to Luis to the packet on the desk and smiled without warmth. "Good," he said. "You've seen it." Luis stepped back like the office had caught fire. Richard set 1 coffee on Dad's desk, then seemed to remember Dad was not there to drink it. He left it anyway. "We need to talk about your locker," he said. I stared at him. "My locker?" "Well, the buyer wants clean access to the premises before final walkthrough. Personal items should be removed by Friday." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. My locker was a dented gray cabinet in the back corner near the old sink. It held gloves, a spare flannel, safety glasses, a photo of Dad and me beside our first big county contract, and a welding hood with my initials scratched into the side. I had opened that locker more mornings than Richard had opened the shop. "Dad is still alive," I said. Richard's face tightened, not with grief, but with irritation that I had brought grief into a business conversation. "Dad is not coming back here." "Well, that wasn't your decision to make." "Someone has to make decisions while you stand around romanticizing rust." Luis flinched at that, but Richard did not notice. Or maybe he did and enjoyed it. I stepped closer to the desk. "Does Dad know you're selling?" Richard leaned both hands on the chair back, claiming the room with posture. Dad knows the shop has become too much. He knew that before he got sick. He just didn't want to upset you. It was a clever lie, because it used love as camouflage. For a second I saw what he was doing. He was not just selling the building. He was trying to sell me a version of Dad where Dad had secretly agreed with him all along. That hurt worse than the packet. You brought a buyer through while I was at hospice, I said. I brought a buyer through while you were unavailable. I was with our father, and I was keeping the family from drowning. There it was again, the family. As if Luis was not family after 22 years, as if the apprentices Dad trained were not part of what we owed, as if I was only family when Richard needed grief to stay quiet. He picked up the sale packet and tapped it against his palm. Harold, I know this is painful, but you need to understand your position. You are an employee. The word hung there. Employee. Not son, not partner in labor, not the man with keys. Employee. I looked through the window at the bay. The first sparks of the morning flashed blue-white near table 2. The sound steadied me. I've been here 41 years, I said, and you've been paid for your work. Richard's voice softened in that false way people use when they are about to cut deeper. That doesn't make you an owner. I almost told him about Dad's whisper. I almost said 2009 right there. But something stopped me. Maybe it was Dad's hand squeezing mine in the hospice room. Maybe it was the memory of him saying family could sweet-talk a man into surrendering peace. Maybe it was the way Richard's eyes kept flicking toward the packet, not worried, not cautious, just impatient. He did not know. Whatever Dad had done, whatever that clause truly meant, Richard did not know enough to be afraid of it. So I did the hardest thing a man can do when his whole life is being insulted. I stayed quiet. Richard mistook that for defeat. Friday, he said. Have your locker cleared by then. I don't want this to become embarrassing. I looked at him. For who? He did not answer. He walked out to take a call, already using his business voice before he reached the side door. Luis remained near the office, pretending to study a work order. After a long moment, he said, Harold, what are you going to do? I picked up my locker key from the desk. It looked small in my hand, smaller than it should have, considering how many mornings it represented. I'm going to visit Dad, I said. But I did not go straight to hospice. I finished the morning because the shop still had work on the schedule. And one thing Dad taught me was that panic never strengthened a weld. I checked the trailer frame. I corrected an angle on a railing job. I called a customer about a repair we could still finish by Thursday, though I did not know if Thursday would mean anything anymore. Every ordinary task felt like touching something that was already being taken. Around noon, Richard came back with Mr. Callahan. They walked the floor again. This time the buyer had another man with him, someone with a tablet who took pictures of electrical panels, storage racks, and the yard gate. Workers watched without watching. I could feel their questions in the silence. Richard did not introduce me as his brother. He said, Harold's been with the shop a long time. Been with, like I was an old broom. Mr. Callahan nodded politely and said, Places like this carry a lot of memories. I wanted to tell him memories were not the same as obligations. Instead, I said, They carry men, too. He looked at me then, maybe hearing something he had not been told to hear. Richard cut in quickly. talking about lot lines and environmental review. By 3, I could not stand the taste of metal in my mouth anymore. I drove to Hospice with my work shirt still smelling of smoke. Dad was awake when I arrived, or close to awake. His eyes followed me. I sat beside him and took off my cap. For a while I listened to the machine and the soft footsteps in the hall. Then I said, "Richard has sale papers." Dad blinked once. "Buyer's already been through twice." Another blink. "He told me to clear my locker by Friday." Dad's jaw tightened. It was small, barely there, but I saw it. I had spent my life reading small changes and hot metal and tired men. I knew anger when it had no strength left to stand. "Dad," I said, leaning forward, "what is in that 2009 clause?" His mouth moved. I bent close enough to feel his breath against my cheek. "Doors," he whispered. I waited. His hand shifted on the blanket. I put my fingers under his. "You keep," he breathed. "Doors." My throat closed. "I don't know if I can fight him." Dad's eyes opened wider then, and for 1 second the old Frank Mason looked out through the sickness. Not strong, not healed, but present. His fingers pressed mine, weakly, clearly. Then he whispered, "Copy." That was all. Copy. Not revenge, not money, not even Richard. Copy. I sat there until he drifted again, and when I finally stood, I knew I was not going back to the shop that night. I drove home as the sky turned the color of cooling steel. My house was quiet. My wife had been gone 6 years, and some evenings the silence had weight. I stood in the hallway for a long time before opening the closet. The metal file box was on the floor behind a stack of old winter coats. I carried it to the kitchen table, the same table where Dad had once sat after my wife's funeral, and fixed a loose chair leg without asking, because that was how he handled grief. I opened the box. Insurance, truck title, tax returns, appliance manuals, my wife's recipe cards wrapped in a rubber band, and beneath them a brown envelope with my father's block handwriting across the front. Herald, 2009, shop lease copy. For a minute I did not open it. I just sat there with my hand on the envelope, hearing Richard's voice in my head. "You are an employee. You were never part of this shop." Then I heard Dad's voice from 17 years earlier, rough and certain across the office desk. "Men get clever when buildings become worth more than work." I slid one finger under the flap and opened the envelope. Inside was the clause I had signed when I still thought protection was something other men needed. The paper smelled faintly of dust and old ink. My signature was at the bottom. Dad's was beside it. And on the last page, clipped behind the legal language, was a small, handwritten note I had never noticed before. "Harold keeps the doors open. This protects the doors." I sat alone at that kitchen table until the room went dark, holding the folder my brother had forgotten. And for the first time since hospice began, I understood that Dad had not left me defenseless. The next morning, I walked into Mason Welding with the brown 2009 folder inside my lunch cooler, wrapped between a thermos and a sandwich I knew I would not eat. I did not carry it in my hand because I did not want Richard to see it. I did not put it in my truck because I no longer trusted the lot, the office, or any place my brother could call company property. It sat beside me on the passenger seat during the drive, quiet and ordinary, like old paperwork had not changed the way the whole world looked. The shop was already awake when I arrived. Bay 1 was open halfway, letting in a strip of cold morning air. Luis was near the cutting table, pretending to sort material, but his eyes went to me the second I stepped through the side door. He knew something had shifted. Men who work with their hands learn to read weight. They know when another man is carrying more than a lunch. I nodded once, nothing more. The buyer was coming at 10. Richard had sent a message to all department leads, though we did not have departments, only men who knew what needed doing. He called it a transition briefing. I read the words on my phone twice while standing beside my locker. Transition. Briefing. Clean words again. A man could bury a whole life under clean words if nobody stopped him. My locker door squeaked when I opened it. Inside, my spare flannel hung on the left hook. My old welding hood sat on the shelf, the one with HM scratched into the side with a nail 30 years ago. A photograph was taped to the inside of the door. Dad and me standing in front of the shop sign after we finished the county bridge railing contract. I was younger in that picture, broad through the shoulders, face blackened with smoke, smiling like I had not yet learned how expensive loyalty could become. Dad was not smiling, but one hand rested on my shoulder. For him, that was a speech. I touched the edge of the photo and left everything where it was. Richard wanted the locker empty by Friday. I wanted him to see it full when his plan stopped moving. At 9:30, Richard arrived in a gray suit that looked too smooth for the building. He had shaved close, polished his shoes, and brought a leather folder instead of the stained canvas bag Dad used for shop papers. Behind him came Mr. Callahan, the buyer, and a woman in a black coat who introduced herself as his transaction counsel. She had careful eyes. She looked at the machines, the men, the office walls, and then at me. Unlike Callahan, she did not pretend the building was just square footage. She saw the silence. Richard clapped his hands once near the office door. "Everyone! If I can have a few minutes." The grinders wound down one by one. The bay settled into a sound I had only heard during power outages and accidents. Men stepped closer, but not too close. Luis stood near the front, arms folded, jaw tight. Richard smiled at them like he was doing them a kindness. "I know there have been rumors," he said, "so I want to speak plainly. Mason Welding is entering a transition period. We have an interested buyer with the resources to make responsible decisions about the property and its assets. Nothing will happen overnight, and everyone will receive the appropriate information." Appropriate. That meant whatever Richard wanted them to know after the ink dried. One of the younger welders, Evan, asked, "Are we losing our jobs?" Richard looked almost offended by the directness. "No one is saying that." "That isn't an answer," Luis said. A ripple moved through the men. Richard's smile thinned. "Employment details will be evaluated after closing." There it was. After closing. Not if, after. Callahan shifted beside him. His attorney wrote something on a pad. I watched Richard's hands while he talked. They were relaxed, confident. He believed the room belonged to him because the papers told him it did. "My father built this company," Richard continued, lowering his voice just enough to sound emotional. "And no one respects that more than I do. But Dad's health has forced us to make difficult decisions. I will not apologize for protecting the value of what he created." I felt heat rise in my chest, but I stayed still. That line was aimed at me. Protecting value. as if value had not shown up before dawn in steel-toed boots for 4 decades, as if value did not have bad knees and smoke in its lungs and a daughter in college, as if Dad's creation was worth more empty than alive. Richard turned toward me then, as if he had rehearsed the angle. "Harold, I know this is hardest on you." The bay became even quieter. I could hear the fluorescent lights humming. "You've been attached to this place for a long time." Attached, like I was moss on a wall. "But I need you to help make this smooth. No more confusion. No more stirring people up. And please, have your personal effects out of the locker by Friday, as discussed." My fingers curled once, then opened. I saw Luis look at me, willing me to answer, or maybe willing me not to. I asked Richard, "Did you tell Mr. Callahan about the operating lease history?" Richard blinked. It was the first crack in his rhythm. "What?" "The lease history," I said, "from 2009. The woman in the black coat stopped writing. Callahan looked from Richard to me. Richard gave a small laugh, the kind meant to teach the room not to take me seriously. "Harold, this is exactly what I mean by confusion. There are decades of old papers in any family business. This one has my signature on it. You signed plenty of employment acknowledgments over the years." "Not this." His face hardened. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not enough. "Do not do this in front of everyone." "You called everyone over." "To reassure them." "No," I said, "to make the sale feel finished before anybody could ask what you left out." That was when Richard lost the softness. It vanished so fast I realized it had never been grief. "You need to remember your place," he said. The words landed across the bay like a dropped beam. Callahan's attorney looked up fully now. Luis took one step forward. Richard pointed toward the office. "You are not an owner. You are not an executive. You are not Dad's spokesperson. You are an employee who has mistaken long service for authority." My ears rang. I could feel every man watching me. I could feel the old photo inside my locker behind me, Dad's hand on my shoulder from another year, another version of the shop. Richard's voice rose, no longer controlled, no longer practical. "This shop has carried you for years, Harold. Dad carried you. I carried the books, the debt, the taxes, the actual responsibility while you played hero with a welding torch. So let me make it clear, since apparently no one has had the nerve." He turned just enough for Callahan to hear, for Luis to hear, for the young men to hear, for the hospice nurses who had come in through the side office door with Dad's medical forms to hear. Then he said it. "You were never part of this shop." The sentence did not knock me down. It did something worse. It made the whole room show me who they were. Evan looked at the floor. Luis closed his eyes like someone had struck him. Callahan's mouth tightened. The attorney's pen stopped. One of the hospice nurses froze in the doorway with a manila envelope held against her chest. And Richard stood there breathing hard, surprised by his own cruelty, but not sorry for it. I had imagined answering him 100 different ways over the years, because men like Richard do not become cruel all at once. They practice in smaller rooms first. But when the moment came, I did not shout. I did not tell him about the nights I slept on that office couch during emergency jobs. I did not remind him who drove Dad home after his first chest scare. I did not ask him how many times he had opened the bay before dawn. I only looked at him and said, "Then you won't mind if my lawyer checks the 2009 clause." The word lawyer changed the air faster than anger ever could have. Richard's eyes narrowed. "You don't have a lawyer." "Dad did." The hospice nurse in the doorway looked at me then, and I saw that she knew something had just passed through the room bigger than a family argument. Richard recovered quickly, or tried to. "Fine," he said with a sharp little laugh. "Waste your money. Bring whatever old paper you want. It won't change title." "It won't change ownership. And it definitely won't change the fact that this transaction is moving forward." Callahan turned to his attorney. "Claire?" She did not answer him right away. She was watching Richard. "Any leasehold or operating interest should have been disclosed," she said carefully. Richard waved a hand. "There is no leasehold interest. Harold is confused." "Then disclose the document," I said. Richard stepped toward me. Luis stepped between us before I knew he was moving. He did not touch Richard. He just stood there, broad and silent, a man with 2 bad knees, still willing to plant himself like a post. Richard looked offended that anyone from the floor would dare become a wall. "This is a family matter," he snapped. Luis said, "You made it a shop matter." For a second I thought Richard might fire him on the spot. Maybe he wanted to. Maybe he knew doing it in front of the buyer would look like what it was. He pulled his coat straight and looked at Callahan. "We should continue this in the office." Claire, the attorney, said, "We should continue after I review whatever document Mr. Mason is referencing." Richard's jaw shifted. "That is unnecessary." "Not for my client." There it was. The first time that morning someone with a pen and a professional tone did not bend toward Richard. He felt it. We all did. He looked back at me with pure warning in his eyes. "You have until 2 o'clock, he said. "Bring your little folder. Then we can end this nonsense properly." I nodded once. 2 o'clock. The meeting broke apart, but no one returned to work the same way. Machines started slowly. Conversations stayed low. Richard took Callahan and Claire into the office and shut the door. Luis walked beside me toward the locker area. "You really have something?" he asked. I opened my locker, took out my old canvas jacket, and slid the lunch cooler strap higher on my shoulder. "I think Dad did." Luis swallowed. "Harold, if this goes bad—" "It already went bad," I said. "Now we find out whether Dad saw it coming." I left through the side door and drove straight to a small law office above a pharmacy on Oak Street. The sign on the window read, "Whitaker and Bell," though Mr. Bell had retired years ago, and Mr. Whitaker looked old enough to have advised Moses on property lines. He had been Dad's lawyer for as long as I could remember. When I was young, I thought of him as a man who appeared only when signatures were needed and adults used their careful voices. I had not seen him in years except at funerals and Rotary breakfasts. His receptionist recognized me before I finished saying my name. "Mr. Mason," she said, softening, "I'm sorry about your father." People had been saying that for weeks, but the words still found new places to hurt. "Thank you. Is Mr. Whitaker in?" 5 minutes later, I was sitting across from Arthur Whitaker in an office packed with file cabinets, framed certificates, and a clock that ticked louder than it needed to. He had white hair, thin hands, and eyes that still missed nothing. I put the brown envelope on his desk. "Dad told me to find my copy," I said. 2009. Mr. Whitaker's face changed before he touched the paper. Not surprise, exactly. Recognition. "Ah," he said. Just that. "Ah." My heart began to pound. You remember it? He lifted the envelope with both hands like it deserved respect. I drafted it. What is it? He slid on his glasses and removed the pages, though I had the feeling he already knew every paragraph. It is an operating lease addendum with protective occupancy rights, notice requirements, and a right of first refusal tied to any transfer of the premises or business assets necessary for continued operation. I stared at him. Mr. Whitaker, I weld for a living. For the first time all morning, he almost smiled. It means your father gave you more than a paycheck, Harold. He gave you a legal interest no buyer should ignore. My throat tightened. Can it stop the sale? That depends on what your brother is selling, what he disclosed, and whether the clause was ever terminated. It wasn't. I never signed anything. Did your father keep the original? I think so. We need it, if possible. He turned the last page toward me, tapping Dad's signature and mine. But this copy is meaningful, especially if your brother has represented that no such interest exists. I leaned back. The chair creaked under me. He told everyone I was never part of the shop. Mr. Whitaker's expression cooled. Did he use those words? In front of the buyer, the workers, even hospice nurses. Good. I looked at him. He raised one hand. Not morally good, legally useful. Witnesses matter. Witnesses matter. It was strange how cold words could become comforting when the other side had used warm words as knives. Mr. Whitaker asked me for the sale packet. I told him what I had seen, but admitted I had not copied it. He frowned. Do you have access to the office files? I have keys, for now. Your father's original folder may be there. I remembered Dad's whisper, copy, doors. He had not said office. He had not said Richard. But there was one place he kept the documents he did not trust to filing cabinets. He had a locked drawer in the old drafting table, I said. Back office, under the blueprints. Mr. Whitaker nodded. Then we retrieve it before 2. We? Harold? I am far too old to let Frank Mason's son walk into a hornet's nest alone with a document I drafted. He stood slowly, then reached for his coat. Call the shop. Tell them you are returning with counsel. Counsel. Another word from Richard's world. But this time it was on my side. We arrived at Mason Welding at 1:15. I drove. Mr. Whitaker sat beside me with a 2009 copy and a leather folio on his lap. He asked very few questions during the ride. Once, as we passed the old railroad crossing, he said, Your father was not a sentimental man on paper. If he wrote that note, he meant it. I had shown him the handwritten line, Harold keeps the doors open. This protects the doors. I asked, Why didn't he tell me what it really meant? Mr. Whitaker looked out the window. Because he knew you might refuse protection if it sounded too much like inheritance. I did not answer because he was right. Pride can look a lot like humility when you do not want to admit you are afraid of being given something. The shop lot was full when we arrived. Richard's car was in Dad's space. Callahan's black SUV was beside it. Another car I did not recognize was parked near the office door. I carried nothing visible. Mr. Whitaker carried the folio. Luis saw us through the bay window and met us inside. He's in the office, Luis said. Buyer, too. Richard's been telling people you're having a hard time with grief. Mr. Whitaker's eyebrows lifted. Has he? Luis looked at him. You're the lawyer? I am one of them, Mr. Whitaker said. Today that should do. We walked toward the office. Every step seemed to pull 41 years up through the soles of my boots. There was the post Dad had backed into with the forklift in 1988 and blamed on architectural weakness. There was the scar on the floor from the boiler repair that nearly cost us 3 fingers between 2 men. There was the break room door where Richard once taped a printed memo about time theft because 2 workers had been drinking coffee 7 minutes past break. Dad had torn it down and told him, "You don't build loyalty with a stopwatch." I wondered if Richard remembered that. I wondered if he remembered anything that did not come with a $sign. Inside the office, Richard was standing behind Dad's desk again. Callahan sat in the chair near the window. Claire had her laptop open. The man I did not know introduced himself as Richard's attorney, Mr. Voss, with a handshake that felt like a business card. Richard looked at Mr. Whitaker and then at me. "Really?" he said. "You brought Dad's fossil?" Mr. Whitaker did not blink. "Good afternoon, Richard." "Arthur, this is unnecessary and frankly embarrassing." "Then it should be quick." Claire said, "Mr. Whitaker, do you have the document?" "I have Mr. Harold Mason's executed copy. I would also like to inspect Frank Mason's original records before anyone continues representing this property as unencumbered." Mr. Voss leaned back. "We have no record of a valid encumbrance affecting transfer." "That may say more about your review than the property." Richard gave a short laugh. "This is absurd. Harold never paid rent. He never owned shares. He never had title." Mr. Whitaker opened the folio. "I did not say he had title. I said he had protected operating rights." The words settled differently in the room than they had in his office. Protected operating rights. Claire turned her laptop slightly. "May I see it?" Mr. Whitaker handed her a copy, not the original. She read. At first, her face did not change. Then she went back to the first page. Then to the signature page. Then to the middle section. Callahan noticed. "Claire?" She held up one finger without looking at him. Richard grew impatient. "It's old. It was probably for some bank issue that expired years ago." "Expiration date?" Claire asked. Mr. Whitaker said, "None unless terminated by signed mutual release or superseding agreement." "Which exists," Richard said quickly. Everyone looked at him. Mr. Voss looked at him too, and that was when I knew he had not told his own attorney everything. "Then produce it," Mr. Whitaker said. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. "I'd have to check." "Do that." Richard glared at me like I had personally dragged the past into the room and made it sit at Dad's desk. Maybe I had. "This doesn't change anything," he said. "It changes disclosure," Claire said. Her voice was calm, but the buyer heard the warning. "And potentially possession, and potentially closing conditions." Callahan sat forward. "Was this disclosed in the diligence materials?" Claire looked at Richard. Richard looked at Voss. Voss looked at the paper. Nobody looked comfortable. I stood near the filing cabinet, hands at my sides, feeling strangely outside my own body. I had imagined fury. I had imagined shouting. Instead, what I felt was grief with a spine in it. Dad had sat in this room 17 years earlier and planned for a day I had not been willing to imagine. He had known Richard's cleverness could one day become hunger. He had known I might be too loyal to defend myself. So he had put his faith in paper, because paper did not get tired, did not get guilted, did not lower its eyes when family raised its voice. Mr. Whitaker turned to me. "Harold, the original folder?" Richard snapped, "He is not going through company files." I said, "Dad told me to find it." "Dad is not competent to authorize anything right now." The cruelty of that line silenced the room. It was legally dressed, but it was still cruelty. I looked at him. He was competent in 2009. Mr. Whitaker stepped between us with the ease of a man who had spent 50 years letting angry people waste energy around him. "Richard, the original document is relevant to a transaction you are attempting to close. Refusing inspection after notice may create its own issue." Mr. Voss cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should locate the folder." Richard turned on him. "You're my attorney." "Yes," Voss said, "which is why I am suggesting we locate the folder." That was the second crack. The first had been Claire's silence. The second was Richard's own lawyer refusing to pretend the paper did not exist. Richard grabbed Dad's key ring from the desk drawer with more force than necessary and tossed it toward me. The keys hit the desktop and slid. "Fine. Put on your little performance." I picked them up. The drafting table was in the back office, a cramped room behind the main office where Dad had kept blueprints, old job sketches, and anything he did not want Richard reorganizing into labeled efficiency. The room smelled like dust and pencil shavings. My hands shook once when I put the key into the lower drawer. Not because I was afraid it would be empty, but because part of me was afraid it would not be. There are moments when proof becomes a kind of final sadness. Before proof, you can still tell yourself people misunderstood each other. After proof, you have to admit someone knew enough to hide the truth. The drawer opened with a scrape. Inside were rolled plans, a box of old stamps, 3 envelopes marked in Dad's handwriting, and a dark green folder tied with string. On the tab, in black marker, Dad had written, "Harold Operating Lease, 2009. Do not remove." I heard someone behind me exhale. It was Luis. I had not realized he had followed us to the doorway. Richard reached past me. "I'll take that." I pulled the folder back. "No." His face flushed. "That is company property." Mr. Whitaker's voice came from behind him. "Then it can be reviewed right here." We returned to the office like a procession nobody had planned. The green folder went on Dad's desk. Not Richard's desk. Dad's. Mr. Whitaker untied the string. The original was inside, along with a notarized page, a board-style acknowledgement for Mason Welding's internal records, and a memo from Dad to himself. Claire read the original. Voss read over her shoulder. Callahan stood now, one hand on the back of his chair. Richard remained near the window, arms crossed, but his confidence was no longer filling the room. It was leaking out in small, visible ways. He tapped his foot. He checked his phone. He said, "This is ridiculous," twice, and nobody answered either time. Claire finally looked at Callahan. "We have a problem." Richard barked, "No, we don't." She ignored him. "The agreement appears to create continuing operational occupancy and notice rights in favor of Harold Mason. It also references a right of first refusal or review if the premises or necessary operating assets are transferred in a way that disrupts Mason Welding's business operations." Callahan stared at Richard. "You told me there were no tenant or operating claims." "There aren't," Richard said. "He's my brother. He works here. This was family paperwork. Mr. Whitaker's voice sharpened for the first time. Family paperwork is still paperwork. Claire turned another page. There is also language requiring written notice to Mr. Harold Mason prior to any transfer that would affect possession, equipment access, or continuation of operations. She looked at me. Did you receive written notice? No. Did you sign a waiver? No. Did anyone offer you right of first refusal? No. Callahan's face changed color, not dramatically, but enough. He looked like a man who had just realized the clean deal he thought he was buying had mud under the carpet. Richard, he said slowly, what exactly did you represent to us? Richard pointed at me. This is a bitter employee trying to sabotage a legitimate sale during a family medical crisis. Luis from the doorway said, He was with Frank during the medical crisis. You were bringing buyers through the bay. Richard spun toward him. Get back to work. Luis did not move. Neither did I. Neither did anyone else visible through the office window. The shop had gone quiet again. Men were gathered beyond the glass, not pretending anymore. They knew. Maybe not the legal words, but they knew the room had turned. Mr. Voss spoke carefully. Given the existence of this document, I would advise pausing any closing activity until we determine its enforceability and any required notices. Pausing? Richard said. His voice cracked on the word. You work for me. Voss closed the folder in front of him. And my advice is to pause. Claire nodded. My client will not wire funds while this remains unresolved. The sentence hit Richard harder than any accusation could have. Money was the language he trusted, and now money had stopped listening. You can't do that, he said to Callahan. Callahan's politeness was gone. I can do whatever my counsel advises when a seller fails to disclose a recorded or enforceable operating interest. It's not recorded. You said it didn't exist. Richard looked at me then, and all the polish was gone from his face. For the first time since Dad got sick, he looked less like a manager and more like a younger brother caught with something in his hand. You're going to destroy this family over an old clause? He said. I thought about the hospice room. I thought about Dad's hand searching the blanket. I thought about my locker, the young welders, Luis's bad knees, the sign with weather on it, and the way Richard had stood in our father's office and told me I had never been part of the place that had taken most of my life and given it meaning. No, I said. You tried to sell the family while Dad was still breathing. I'm trying to find out why he thought I needed protection from you. Nobody spoke. Richard's eyes went to the green folder, then to Dad's signature. I watched him recognize it. Not the legality, not yet. Something worse for him. The handwriting. Dad's block letters. Dad's deliberate ink. Dad had not been confused. Dad had not been sentimental. Dad had seen enough in 2009 to prepare for a day Richard thought he could own. Claire gathered her papers. We are suspending closing review pending resolution. Voss said quietly, Richard, we should talk privately. Callahan pushed back his chair. No funds move. Those 4 words rang through the office. No funds move. The sale did not die in that moment. Not completely. Life is not that clean, and law rarely gives you thunder when a locked door will do. But the closing stopped. The wire stopped. The buyer stopped trusting Richard. And for the first time since he had slid those papers across Dad's desk, my brother had to stand in the shop with everyone watching and understand that the man he called an employee had been protected by the one man whose name was on the sign. I picked up the green folder, but Mr. Whitaker gently put his hand over it. "We'll keep this on the desk for now," he said. "Let everyone see what your father intended." Through the office glass, I saw Luis standing with the others. He looked at the folder, then at me. Slowly, he gave one nod. It was not celebration. It was recognition. Richard saw it too, and that seemed to hurt him more than the lawyers. Because the money had paused, yes. The sale had frozen, yes. But something else had moved. Something he could not file, sell, or stamp. The shop had heard him say, "I was never part of it." Now the shop was looking at the proof Dad left behind, and it was beginning to answer. The office did not erupt after Claire said no funds would move. That would have been easier in a way. If Richard had shouted, if Callahan had stormed out, if Mr. Whitaker had slammed a fist on Dad's desk, then the moment might have felt like a fight with a winner and a loser. Instead, everything became quiet in the way a shop becomes quiet after a machine breaks, and every man waits to see what the damage will cost. Richard stood by the window with his phone in his hand, but he did not call anyone. Callahan's attorney packed her papers slowly, placing each page into her case with the careful patience of someone who had just stepped away from a bad deal before it closed around her client's throat. Mr. Voss, Richard's lawyer, leaned close to him and spoke in a voice too low for the rest of us to hear, though I could guess the shape of it. "Stop talking. Do not make this worse. Produce every document, and for once in his life—" Richard looked like he wanted paperwork to disappear. I stood beside Dad's desk with the green 2009 folder lying open between us all. The folder looked small against the old wood. It did not glow. It did not thunder. It was just paper, ink, signatures, and a strip of string that had held still for 17 years while my brother built a version of the world where I had no place in it. Through the office glass, the men on the floor had stopped pretending to work. Luis stood at the front, arms folded, eyes fixed on the folder. Evan was behind him, still wearing one glove. 2 other men stood near the cutting table. No one smiled. No one cheered. They understood what Richard had not. This was not about a clever trick. This was about whether the years a man gave to a place could be erased by someone who knew which drawer held the deed. Callahan finally turned to me. "Mr. Mason," he said, and the formality felt strange after hearing my brother call me an employee like it was a stain. "Were you aware your rights were not disclosed to us?" I looked at Richard before answering. "Until yesterday, I didn't know Richard was trying to close before Dad passed." Richard's face tightened. "Do not use Dad as a shield." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the sentence was so perfectly backwards it felt rehearsed by the devil himself. "I sat beside him while you walked buyers through his shop, because someone had to be responsible." Responsible men tell the truth before they take the money. Callahan's jaw shifted. Claire touched his sleeve lightly, warning him not to say too much, but he ignored it long enough to look at Richard. "We were told there were no operating claims, no internal objections, no occupancy issues, and no pending family disputes that could affect transfer." Richard said, "There were no disputes until Harold created one." Mr. Whitaker closed the folder with one dry, final movement. "No, Richard. The dispute began when you attempted to sell around an interest your father deliberately preserved." Mr. Voss said, "We should pause this discussion." "That is the first sensible thing I have heard from your side," Mr. Whitaker replied. Richard's eyes flashed, but even he knew the room had turned into something he could not manage with tone. Callahan and Claire left first. Before stepping out, Callahan paused near the office door and looked through the glass at the floor. He seemed to see it differently now, not as a property with equipment, not as an acquisition with frontage and access, but as a living place full of people he had nearly inherited as an afterthought. He looked back at me. "My counsel will contact Mr. Whitaker," he said. "Until then, we are suspended." Richard flinched at that word. Suspended. It sounded too much like judgment. When the buyer's SUV pulled out of the lot, the shop remained still. Richard turned on me the second the door shut. "Do you have any idea what you just cost this family?" I looked at him for a long moment. He was red-faced, furious, wounded in the only place he seemed to feel deeply: control. "No," I said, "but I know what you were willing to cost everyone else." He threw one hand toward the bay. "Everyone else? You mean them? The men who clock in and clock out? They are not family, Harold." Louise heard that through the glass. So did the others. Richard realized it too late, but this time the words could not be stuffed back into his expensive coat. The office door was still open. The shop had heard him. Louise stepped inside first. He did not ask permission. His boots left dark marks on the office floor because he had been working when Richard called him not family. And there was something right about the dirt coming in with him. "Frank Mason knew my daughter's name," Louise said. His voice was not loud, but every man on the floor could hear it. "When my wife got sick, he let me leave early for chemo days, and Harold covered my jobs without putting it on a sheet. When the south compressor died, Harold stayed until 2 in the morning, so none of us lost a week's pay. When Evan here came in green and scared, Harold trained him before he ever let him touch a customer job. So if we're talking family, Richard, I'd be real careful deciding who counts." Richard's mouth tightened. "This is not your concern." Louise nodded once, slowly. "That's what you never understood. The shop was always our concern. You just liked the part that could be sold." Evan stepped into the doorway behind him. He was 24, maybe 25, with nervous hands and a good eye for line work. "Mr. Mason fixed my first weld after hours," he said. "Didn't make me feel stupid. Said the metal already knew I messed up, no need for him to say it too." A few men laughed softly. Not because the situation was light, but because it sounded exactly like me and exactly like Dad before me. I did not know where to look. Praise can be harder to stand under than insult when you have spent your life treating work as its own answer. Richard saw the men behind Louise, saw the buyer gone, saw both lawyers watching him, and tried one last time to climb back into authority. "All of you need to return to work," he said. No one moved. That was the moment I think he finally understood, not the clause, not the legal risk, not even the suspended money. He understood that the shop had stopped obeying the version of him he had been selling. Mr. Whitaker picked up the green folder and held it against his chest. "Richard, my advice is that no further representations be made regarding sale, transfer, possession, or employee removal until counsel has reviewed every related document." Mr. Voss nodded, looking tired. "I agree." Richard stared at his own attorney as if betrayal had come from the wrong direction. "So that's it," he said. He waves old paper around and everyone bows? I stepped closer to Dad's desk. No one is bowing. You ruined the sale. You hid the truth. I was trying to protect Dad's estate. You were trying to cash out before Dad could even be buried. The words landed hard, and for the first time Richard had no clean replacement for them. His face changed. Something like shame moved across it, but it was tangled with anger and too late to help him. He grabbed his coat from the chair. You always wanted them to love you more, he said. That's what this is. You and Dad and all your little shop rituals. You needed to be the loyal son. I looked at him, and suddenly he seemed less powerful than he had in years. Not harmless, never that, but smaller. A man who had mistaken being outside the fire for being above the men who stood in it. No. Richard, I said, I needed you not to sell our father's life while he was still fighting for breath. His eyes shone, and for one brief second I thought he might say something human. Instead, he said, You'll regret this when there's nothing left to save. Then he walked out, past Luis, past the men, past the machines he had never learned to hear. The side door slammed behind him, and the sound rolled through the bay like a final bad note. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Luis turned to me and said, What now? I looked around the shop. It was not saved yet. That mattered. Stories make it sound like one hidden document fixes everything, but real life does not work that way. There would be meetings, filings, notices, arguments, valuations, and men in clean offices deciding how much weight old promises carried. Richard would not disappear. The buyer might return or might not. Dad was still in hospice. The roof still leaked near Bay 3. The south compressor still coughed before it started. But the sail had stopped moving over us like weather. For the first time, we could stand under our own roof and breathe. Now, I said, we've finished today's jobs. Luis looked at me, then smiled for the first time all week. Frank would like that. Frank would complain we were already behind. That got a real laugh from the men. Small, rough, tired, but real. The machines started again one by one. The first grinder screamed back to life. A welding arc flashed blue at table 2. The fans turned overhead. The shop did not become whole in that moment, but it became alive again, and that was enough to start. Mr. Whitaker stayed in the office with me after the floor returned to work. He made copies of the original folder, logged each page, and told me he would prepare formal notice before the end of the day. Callahan may still want the property, he said, but if he does, he deals with the truth now. Your rights, the workers' situation, your father's intent. No more pretending you are a loose tool in the corner. I nodded. Can Richard still fight it? Of course. I appreciated that he did not soften the answer. Can he win? Mr. Whitaker removed his glasses and wiped them with a cloth. Law is never as clean as people think. But your father did not leave you a wish, Harold. He left you a position. A position? I had spent my life standing at welding tables, under lifts, beside machines, behind Dad when bankmen came in, near the back during family discussions because Richard understood words I did not. All that time, Dad had quietly made sure I had a position. Not louder than Richard's, not prettier, but real. By late afternoon, word had traveled without anyone making an announcement. Men came by my station for reasons that were not reasons. Evan asked whether he should still finish the rail job. Luis brought me a coffee and pretended he had made too much. Old Marty from the machine shop next door stopped in and said he heard there was some paper trouble, then shook my hand with both of his. I did not know what to do with all of it. Every nod felt like someone handing me a piece of myself I had not realized Richard had taken. Around 5, when the last job was cooling and the winter light had gone flat through the bay windows, I drove back to Hospice. I carried a copy of the 2009 clause and Dad's handwritten note in a clear sleeve. The original stayed with Mr. Whitaker, locked away properly this time. Dad was asleep when I entered. His room smelled faintly of antiseptic and the lavender lotion one of the nurses used on his hands. The television was off. The window blinds were half open, showing a strip of gray sky. I sat beside him and waited. For a while, I listened to his breathing and thought about how unfair it was that a man could build something for 40 years and then be made so small by sickness that all his strength had to travel through paper. His eyes opened just before 6. They moved slowly until they found me. I leaned forward. "Dad," I said, "we found the folder." His fingers twitched against the blanket. I placed my hand under his. Richard tried to close today. The buyer was there. Lawyers, too. Dad watched me with those cloudy eyes. Mr. Whitaker brought out the clause. The sale stopped. No funds moved. His hand tightened. Not much. Enough. My voice broke before I could stop it. "You knew, didn't you?" He breathed in, shallow and rough. His lips moved. I bent close. The words were barely air. "Knew you?" I closed my eyes. For weeks I had wanted him to say he knew Richard would do it, that he had predicted the betrayal, that he had seen the whole thing coming. But Dad, even at the edge of leaving, gave me the truer answer. He had not built the clause only because he knew Richard. He built it because he knew me. He knew I would work without asking. He knew I would stay quiet to keep peace. He knew I would let people call my loyalty sentiment if defending myself felt too much like greed. He knew I might surrender the place I had kept alive, because I did not want to look like I was taking something. The clause was not just a trap for Richard. It was a hand on my shoulder from 17 years away, telling me not to step back when I had earned the right to stand. I took the note from the sleeve and read it aloud, though I was not sure he needed to hear it. "Harold keeps the doors open. This protects the doors." Dad's eyes closed for a moment. When they opened again, there was water in them. I had seen my father burned, cut, bruised, sick, furious, and exhausted. I had seen him carry grief like a steel beam across his back. I had not seen him cry more than twice in my life. His fingers moved, and I placed the paper where he could touch the edge. He did not have the strength to lift it. He only rested his fingertips on the note. "Shop?" he whispered. I wiped my face with the heel of my hand. "Still open." His mouth shifted. It was not quite a smile, but it was close enough for me to carry. "Good," he breathed. That was all he had. That was enough. 3 days later, Richard's attorney sent formal notice disputing the clause. Mr. Whitaker answered before lunch. A week after that, Callahan's side requested a new meeting, this time with full disclosure, employee transition terms, and my rights acknowledged in writing. Richard did not attend the first half. When he finally came in, he looked like a man who had not slept well, which was fitting because the rest of us had lost plenty of sleep while he chased a clean payday. The final arrangement was not the fairy tale some people would want to hear. I did not become rich overnight. Richard did not go to prison. The shop did not magically return to the way it had been before hospice and betrayal cracked it open. What happened was quieter and, to me, better. The original sale collapsed. Callahan would not proceed under Richard's terms, and the probate review forced every interested party to account for Dad's 2009 agreement. A new structure was negotiated months later. The property could not be transferred without satisfying my operating rights. The workers received written protections through the transition period, and Mason Welding's name could not be stripped off the building like an old sticker. I was given the choice Dad had meant for me to have all along. Not charity, not a favor, a choice. In the end, I agreed to a partial sale of the property, only after the operating business was separated and preserved. Luis became operations manager on paper, though he had been doing half the job for years. Evan stayed. The old welding mask remained on the wall. Dad's desk stayed in the office, not because it was practical, but because some things earned their place by holding the weight of the men who used them. Richard received less than he expected, and more than I sometimes think he deserved. We spoke only through lawyers for a while. Then, after Dad's funeral, he came to the shop once. He stood outside the bay door in a black coat, looking at the sign like it had become written in a language he could not read. I met him near the threshold. For a long time, neither of us said anything. Finally, he looked past me at the men working inside. "You got what you wanted," he said. I thought about correcting him. I thought about telling him nobody wanted hospice, betrayal, lawyers, or a father's protection delivered through old ink because his sons could not protect each other. But I was tired of giving Richard answers he would only twist into weapons. "No," I said. "Dad got what he wanted." He looked at me then. His face changed just a little. And what was that? I stepped aside so he could see into the bay. Luis was checking a job sheet. Evan was welding at table 2. The fans were turning overhead. Sparks fell bright and brief in the afternoon light. "The door stayed open," I said. Richard swallowed. For 1 second I thought he might apologize. Maybe he almost did. Maybe almost is the closest some men ever get to the truth. Instead, he nodded once, turned, and walked back to his car. I watched him leave without calling after him. Some endings do not need forgiveness to be finished. Some only need the locked door to remain unlocked for the people who earned the right to enter. Months later, when the new papers were signed and the first winter morning came hard and silver over the lot, I arrived before sunrise like I always had. The old sign was still there. Mason Welding. Weathered, patched, stubborn. I unlocked the side door, turned on the bay lights, and listened as the building woke around me. In the office, Dad's green folder sat in a framed case beside his first welding mask. Under it, I'd placed a small brass plate with the words from his note. "Harold keeps the doors open. This protects the doors." I stood there for a while with my hand on the office chair, remembering the day Richard had looked me in the eye and said I was never part of this shop. He had meant to erase me. But all he did was force the truth into daylight. Because being part of something is not always about whose name is typed at the top of a deed. Sometimes it is whose boots wore down the floor, whose hands knew which machine was failing by sound, whose father saw the future clearly enough to hide love inside a clause, Richard thought the 2009 paperwork was old dust. I learned it was Dad's last wave standing beside me. And every morning after that, when I unlocked the shop and heard the first fan turn above the bay, I understood what he had been telling me all along. I was not protected because I was weak. I was protected because I belonged.